Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah. It is a wonderful time of year to be a bookish football fan because the European Championships are on at the moment, where we have basically a mini World Cup of football but for the European nations, and I love it. I'm not a huge international football fan because I'm Welsh, I support Wales and my team suck and don't often qualify, but this year Scotland qualified. I live in Scotland, I have done for the last almost 3 years, and I love it here, and I feel Welsh and Scottish, I would say. So obviously I really wanted Scotland to do well. This video is a little bit late. We're now almost at the end of the first stage, the group stages of the Euros, because I cannot get my life together. It's fine, we're still going to do it anyway. And yeah, I've been wanting to make a video kind of like this for a while. I've been wanting to do a video where I recommend you a book from every country that I've been to, and I still maybe will try that, but I thought, well, the Euros are on, why not just do it with all the countries that have qualified for this particular tournament this year. This video is also very much inspired by Hannah from Hannah Lost the Plot. She's done a series of amazing videos where she's read a book from every single country that is competing in this year's tournament, and she's read them this year and she's pitting them against each other in a very complex system with a lot more creativity than I could ever muster, and yeah, even if you don't like football, I think you will really like the videos she's done where she's tried to predict the winner of the Euros by judging which book was her favourite out of all the countries. There's a lot of drama and heartbreak, and yeah, it's very reminiscent of the actual Euros for a football fan. So I would highly recommend you check out those videos. But for my version, I haven't necessarily read a book from every single one of these countries because I just haven't done that yet, and there's no way I was going to do that this year because I can't even get my act together to film a video in time. I was never going to read the books from however many countries are competing in this tournament. I cannot do maths. That's why I am an English literature girly. So I'm going to split this video into two sections. So we're going to have first all the countries that I've read from, and I'm going to recommend you a book from each of those, and then we'll move on to the countries that I haven't yet read from and a book that is on my TBR from each of those countries. So without further ado, let's get into the book recommendations. So we're going to start first with Germany, who were this year's host nation, and they were the first team to play. They played Scotland, absolutely humiliated them. We don't talk about that. But Germany are the team that I now want to win. I normally support Germany in international football tournaments because, like I said, my country often fails to qualify. Scotland also often fails to qualify, and I'm not going to support England. I just can't do that to myself. And Germany's sort of the next country that I have the most vested interest in, I suppose. I lived in Germany for a while, I speak German, and I have a lot of German friends, so I think, yeah, I'd like to see them do well, even though I do think it's quite funny when they do badly. But yeah, we'll start with Germany, and I could make a whole video recommending German books. Maybe I'll do that sometime. But the one that I've picked is Not a Novel by Johny Erpenbeck, and this is translated from German by Kurt Beals. I have never read any of Johny Erpenbeck's fiction. She's written a few fiction books. I have Kairos, her most recent work. I bought a copy of that because it won this year's International Booker Prize, and I really would like to read that, but this is a piece of non-fiction, as the title Not a Novel would suggest. So this is a collection of essays and speeches, mostly, that Johny Erpenbeck has given in her lifetime. She is a writer who came from the former East Germany, the GDR, and she writes a lot about her childhood and identity surrounding growing up in the GDR, and talks a lot about how the country she was born in and sort of the culture and everything surrounding her childhood. She talks a lot about how it now belongs in a museum, like that place doesn't exist anymore, that culture doesn't exist anymore, and I think it's a really interesting look at German identity in a post-unification era. She also talks a lot about German writers who have influenced her. I'd say that was probably my least favourite section of the book, but I still very much enjoyed it. My very favourite speech is a speech called Time. You can see how much I loved it because I've like tabbed it really, really scruffily. But yeah, my favourite quote, I suppose, my favourite speech in general was one called Time. And she's really talking about identity as somebody whose home nation now doesn't exist. And she says, "What should I say then when I'm asked to say who I am? Should I say that I'm someone whose childhood can now only be seen in a museum or in black and white photographs, rows of crumbling houses, the Fernsehturm, happy pioneers, a workers' brigade party with dancing and so on? Or I'm someone whose father's parents fled from Germany at the beginning of the war and whose mother's family fled to Germany at the end of the war." And yeah, it's full of like really interesting, insightful reflections like that. So yeah, I would highly recommend this one, particularly if you're a fan of Rachel Cusk's non-fiction. I think you will like this too. That, by the way, is probably the only book that I'm going to hold up to show you because it was already in this room. The rest are all downstairs and I'm too lazy to go and get them. Moving on to Scotland, who are very much now out of the tournament. It was incredibly disappointing, but not at all surprising. And I have no choice but to recommend Poor Things by Alasdair Gray from Scotland because it's just an icon of Scottish literature, and the recent film really did it dirty, I'm afraid. This follows a man called Godwin Baxter who finds the body of a woman who has just died by suicide. He finds her in the river, pulls her out, and she is pregnant with a child, and he decides to reanimate her by replacing her brain with the brain of her unborn child. So it's a postmodern retelling of Frankenstein, in case that wasn't immediately obvious to you. It's set in like a similar sort of time to Frankenstein's, like 19th century. So he brings this woman back to life with a child's brain, calls her Bella, and you can imagine how disgusting all the men in this book are to her. And one in particular, McCandless, becomes infatuated by her, even though she is a child in an adult's body. It raises a lot of themes about this like feminism and sex in general, but we're really getting sort of part of the story told through the lens of the male gaze, and then we also get Bella's perspective as well, as she sort of comes into herself as a person in her own right and really starts to explore her sexuality. She starts to explore morality and ethics and sort of garnering her own opinions, and we really see the attitudes of the men in her life change towards her once she starts to become a person in her own right and not the person that they have projected onto her body based on its aesthetics. I think this is a really clever and original story. I particularly like that even though it's set in the 19th century and deals with a lot of the kind of themes you would expect to see in a Victorian novel, so like class and empire and sex and gender, it takes those themes and sort of transplants them into a more, not necessarily a more modern context because it's still set in a historical setting, but it just makes those themes more recognisable to a modern reader, I suppose. And it's really like more of a commentary on sort of society at the start of the 1990s when this was written than it is a commentary on Victorian society, but it uses the Victorian society to illustrate how things haven't really changed since then in regards to sort of things that, say, like Dickens is writing about, like poverty and class and all those kind of things. There's not a huge amount of difference between then and now. So yeah, I think it's really clever and original, and if you're going to watch the film or read the book, I would definitely recommend that you read the book instead. The film's very aesthetically pleasing, I think, but yeah, to really get to the crux of the story you need to read the book. Next up is Hungary, and for me that will always be Queen Magda, and I'm going to recommend The Door, translated by Len Rix, which is one of my favourite books of all time. So this, I guess, is auto-fictitious in a way. We're following a writer who's also called Magda, who employs... She's kind of part of the more middle class, and she employs Emerence, a housekeeper who is a lot older than her and is also of a lower sort of social class than her. And the whole book is about their relationship, or more Magda trying to have a relationship with Emerence, who always holds her at a distance. So nobody is allowed through the door of Emerence's home. There's something in that house that she is keeping a secret, and she doesn't want anybody to know about it, and she doesn't care sort of what happens. She's adamant that nobody is going to come into this house. I would say this is definitely a story of unrequited love, unrequited maternal / platonic love. Emerence definitely serves as more of a maternal figure to Magda, but she is in no way a warm maternal character. She is very prickly and set in her ways, and it really illustrates the difference between classes and between generations as well. So this is set in sort of between the 1960s and the 1980s. It's set in obviously communist Hungary at the time. I think a lot of the book was quite highly censored at the time. Magda in the novel is very critical of censorship that she is being put through, and it's really sort of impacting her career as a writer, because so much of what she wants to write about is being censored. There is no way to make this novel sound good to somebody who is not an intensely character-driven reader, because there is very, very little plot in this, and it really is just about the relationship between these two unlikely friends who also have a very strained kind of love-hate relationship. Emerence can be very cruel to Magda, and Magda can be quite cruel to Emerence in return, I would say. But it's just, there's something so sinister and jarring and unsettling about it. I think Magda Szabo is just the queen of writing very nuanced, layered characters, and you really feel what they're going through. There's a lot of miscommunication in this book, when Magda and Emerence just misinterpret each other, and instead of talking about it, they just go into a fight and just spend weeks not saying anything to each other. We get glimpses into Emerence's past, which is really awful and really heartbreaking, and you can really see how her past shaped her as a person. And like I said, it really illustrates the reasons for that generational divide, and there is a big gulf between the generations, and older people being very set in their ways and just like, this is how we do things, and not wanting to sort of progress, and writers like Magda, who are of a younger generation and are sort of a lot more politically engaged and just want to sort of bring about change, and there's a real clash between those kinds of personalities. It's just such a fantastic book. If you like character-driven books, you absolutely have to read this. It's a masterpiece. Next up we have Albania, and can we just take a moment for the Albania-Croatia game that they played in the group stages. It was in the unemployed slot, the 2 p.m. slot. I watched it at my desk, and it was just perfect, just everything you want in a football match. And yeah, I'm still riding a high from that game. For Albania, I'm going to recommend Free by Lea Ypi, which is a memoir quite similar to not a novel in the themes it discusses, I suppose. It's a memoir following Lea's life, growing up under Soviet-style socialism in the 1980s, and then her country transitioning to so-called freedom in the 1990s when she was a teenager. So at its heart, this book is a discussion and unpacking of Western narratives of freedom. So it talks a lot about what freedom actually is and the cost of freedom, I suppose. So yeah, it's really talking about how the West has this ideal of freedom that it's transplanting into an Albanian context, and it's now saying, you know, you have the freedom to travel, and it's like, well, we no longer have the money to travel, it's so expensive. And also, is there freedom for travel because the Western European nations are still very aggressive in their stance against Albanian people travelling to their countries? It talks about having the freedom to having Western products, and it's just like, well, we now no longer have jobs, we can't afford these products, and you know, did we want them anyway? We were quite happy a lot of the time with like the products that we had. Like, why are your products sort of deemed to be better because they're Western? And it also talks a lot about the chaos that the country was plummeted into economically. So many people lost their jobs and livelihoods, and it really paved the way for organised crime and human trafficking. So although people under socialism weren't free, because there was, like, it's spoken about at the start of the novel, like people were imprisoned or killed for having opposing views to the government, but it's still not freedom, and it's not as simple as just being like, oh, you were oppressed then and you are free now. And it really dismantles the concept of freedom within a Western capitalist context, which I really appreciated. For the Netherlands, I'm really struggling because I've read a few Dutch books. The ones I've read that I can think of off the top of my head are The Discomfort of Evening, which I absolutely hated. We had to remove this post, which I thought was okay, but isn't necessarily one that I would recommend. Under the Skin by Michel Faber, and The Following Story by Ses Notteboom. I think my favourite of all of those was actually The Following Story, but I'm not going to recommend that one because I don't think it's the most recommendable book of all of them. So the one I'm going to pick, I think, is Under the Skin by Michel Faber, and this is a deeply unsettling horror thriller which follows a woman who drives around in a car picking up male hitchhikers. It's very dark, it's very gruesome, and I don't want to give you any more than that because I think a lot of the blurbs really spoil the twist in this, and I don't want to do that. So yeah, I think it's best not to know. But overall, my pool of knowledge for Dutch literature is just quite underwhelming. So if you have any Dutch recommendations that you think I will enjoy, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Next up we have Poland, who I still haven't forgiven for robbing Wales of their place in the Euros, but they're also now out, so it's fine, I suppose. And yeah, the recommendation I have for Poland is a really, really good book. It's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk, and this is translated from Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This book is so good. I read it years ago and I still think about it. This is a noiry, literary, eco-thriller in which we're following Janina, who is an old woman who's very eccentric and lives a very reclusive life in this remote Polish village. It's set in winter and there really aren't many people around because most of the inhabitants of the village are just people who have holiday homes there and only come in the summer. So it's really just her and a few other people who live there. One day she discovers that one of her male neighbours has been killed, and from there we see the same thing happen again and again, like really grisly, gruesome murders, and Janina takes it upon herself to figure out what is happening, and she is trying to convince people that it's the animals of the forest who have killed these men and they're taking their revenge on the men for hunting them for their meat, essentially. It's a really dark book that leaves you feeling so on edge and unsettled, and Janine is just the perfect unreliable narrator. Next up is Denmark, and I'm going to recommend The Faces by Tove Ditlevsen, and this is translated from the Danish by Tiina Nunally. This kind of book is like catnip to me. It features an unhinged, unreliable narrator suffering from a psychotic episode. It has discussions of motherhood, and yeah, I just love all of those things. Basically, like, deranged mothers is like my ideal genre of book as somebody who is also a deranged mother. So in The Faces we follow a character called Lisa, who is a children's author, and she becomes convinced that her housekeeper is having an affair with her husband, and also with her teenage son, I think. And she is convinced that she heard about this affair through the pipes in her house, and is convinced that they are conspiring against her to put her in a mental institution. And she does end up in a mental institution, and we don't really know why she ends up there other than that she is very sick. We don't have an anchored narrative at all, and we're never really sure what is real, what's just a figment of her very sick mind. And it's all very nightmarish, in the sense that it actually feels like a dream sequence. It's really a terrifying look at mental illness. What I really like about this book is the way it discusses like madness and questions if insanity actually poses more freedom than sanity. It really probes how we view madness and sanity in the context of a woman's place within society and kind of the expectations that are placed upon women. And I think what she's really getting at is the question of whether being insane is any less sane than, you know, just being a mother, a wife, an employee, and just how deeply unhinged our society is, just as a whole, rather than like the insanity being placed on individuals who like buck against that trend. I think a lot of these books could be in conversation with each other. You can really tell that I have a type when it comes to literature. But yeah, I also think The Faces is really beautifully written as well. It starts off a little bit heavy-handed with the similes, but then once it settles into itself, I think, yeah, it's really, really beautiful. Next up we have England, and obviously I read a lot of English books because I live in the UK, but I think the one that best encapsulates England at this particular period in time is Natasha Brown's Assembly. It was published in, I think, 2021, so it's a couple of years old now, but I still think it's very relevant, and I think we can learn a lot from it about the current political landscape of England and I guess of the UK as a whole. So Assembly follows a young black woman living in London who sort of ostensibly has it all. She's sort of forged a successful career in finance for herself, like against all odds. You know, she has this like triple whammy of oppression in that she's from a working class background, she's black, and she's a woman. And yeah, it seems like she has the perfect life from the outside, but inwardly she just despises it all. She hates the hypocrisy of it. She hates the idea that she has had to sacrifice morals to get there, that she's seen as like the embodiment of diversity in the finance sector. So, you know, everyone looks at her and it's just like, oh, she's a young black woman who didn't come from money, so therefore this industry cannot be racist, it cannot be sexist, it cannot be classist. And obviously it is all of those things because she is the exception and not the norm. So the whole novel, it's very short. It's like a tiny little book told in like a series of vignettes, so you can read it in like an hour or so. It's really, really quick. And the whole thing centres on her preparing to attend a garden party that's being thrown by her boyfriend's parents. Her boyfriend is white and comes from old money. I don't think this is a spoiler because you find out really on in the book that the narrator also has just found out that she has cancer and has decided that she is going to keep this a secret from everyone in her life, including her boyfriend, and she is going to refuse treatment for this. So she is essentially just allowing herself to become untethered from life. She's going to die, and she thinks that this is the only option that she has, that she cannot continue to exist in society the way that it is. So by continuing to work in the finance sector, she sees herself as complicit in its oppression, but she also feels like she can't step away from that because she owes it to her parents. Her parents worked so hard and sacrificed so much of their their lives for her to have this position in society, and she just feels completely torn between these two identities at war within herself. There's a whole list of what this book covers. So it talks about generational wealth versus new money, racism and microaggressions in the workplace, the lasting legacy of empire, the difficulty of forming an identity, like I said, when you're sort of stuck between two different cultures. So the narrator talks about how her parents really like shedded their culture deliberately because they were told to assimilate, and because it was such a racist society that they were in, they just did their best to conform to, you know, British standards and British ways of doing things. So she really hasn't been passed on any of their heritage, really. She says, I only know Jamaica from stories. And yet, despite them having given up all that, because she is a black person, she is just never going to be seen as British in a society that is so racist. So she's really stuck in a limbo between those two cultures, not really knowing, you know, where she's from or like what culture she belongs to. She says, born here, parents born here, always lived here, still never from here. Their culture becomes parody on my body. And I really like the way that their culture could refer to either Jamaican culture from her parents or British culture, because, you know, she doesn't belong in either world. Also, as a cheeky bonus recommendation, since this is a European tournament, I'm gonna suggest Afropean, Notes from a Black Europe by Johnny Pitts. So this is a travel memoir of sorts, and it documents Johnny Pitt's life, sort of growing up in Sheffield as the only mixed race child on a very white working class estate. And he goes on this journey to find and speak to Europeans of African descent and talk to them about how they forge new identities within these European spaces, within, you know, homogeneously white areas. And I think this would be a really interesting book to read alongside Assembly, and yeah, it's just really entertaining. I highly recommend the audiobook for that one because Johnny Pitts narrates it and he does a fantastic job. I think my pick for Romania is a really tiny one, and one that should be read in the context of the genocide that's happening in Gaza at the moment. I'm going to recommend Night by Elie Wiesel, which is a memoir of Elie's life growing up as a Romanian Jew who, along with his family, was taken to various concentration camps, I think Auschwitz and then Buchenwald. But the thing that affected me the most about this Holocaust memoir in particular is that Wiesel really grapples with sort of how the genocide was allowed to happen. I mean, why is a question that's harder to comprehend, but yeah, it really talks about complicity, not just from the Nazis and sympathisers of the Nazis, but also from other victims who, while they were in the concentration camps, committed awful atrocities on each other. In some cases, you know, collaborating with camp guards in exchange for food and other privileges. And it really reckons with the loss of humanity, not just in the way that they were treated by the Nazis, but in the way that they betrayed their own humanity just in order to survive. It really questions to what extent this was actually complicity and how much was just, you know, people trying to get by in an impossibly awful situation. I think it paints a really gruesome picture of humanity and the loss of childhood innocence. Wiesel and his family were warned by one of their community leaders that, you know, what was happening to Jews in Europe at the time, and like so many people, they just didn't believe it. They didn't believe it could be true, and so Wiesel's really grappling with the guilt about this too. And like I said, I think Wiesel makes it abundantly clear how the genocide was aided by, you know, warnings being ignored and by people who didn't have, you know, a stake in it just kind of looking away and not saying anything, even when they knew what was, they knew about the depraved things that were being done to these people. And the whole point of the book is just Wiesel presenting the Holocaust as what it was and not trying to make it any more palatable to the reader. I mean, it's very difficult to read, but in order to reiterate that this should never be allowed to happen again, and unfortunately we're still very much seeing that this is happening in other parts of the world, with full endorsements from governments in the global north and people who look away because they don't want to get political. So I think it's a really timely and important read, and it was translated into English by Wiesel's wife Marion. I'm going to shift the tone a little bit, as for Ukraine I'm recommending Vita Nostra, and this is by Marina and Sergey Diachenko and is translated by Julia Meitov-Hersey. This book is unlike anything I've ever read before. It's lacking in typical Western narrative and plot structures. It's not really character driven either. We're following a 16-year-old girl called Sasha, and she goes on holiday with her mum, and while she's there she is stalked by a very sinister character called Faber, who, after stalking her for some time, eventually tasks her with taking off all her clothes and swimming out into the sea, touching one of the boys in the ocean and then swimming back again. And she finds that she's powerless to resist this. Like, she has to do it, for reasons I won't spoil, but when she completes the task, she gets to the shore and vomits some gold coins. And from there, Faber becomes a very regular fixture in her life, popping up at very strange times, even when she gets back home, asking her to do ridiculous and often very strenuous tasks in exchange for coins, which she always vomits up every time. Eventually, Faber offers Sasha a place at the Institute of Special Technologies, and again she feels powerless to resist taking this place at this mysterious university in a town that nobody has ever heard of. She gets there. None of the students has any idea why they're there. They were all sort of specially chosen to go. They're given textbooks to study, but they're just complete nonsense, with no direction given on how to interpret this nonsense. And the school is really ruled by terror, and punishments are dished out not to students but to their families if they sort of step out of line or don't perform well enough academically. I don't think I've ever read a book that shuns plot and characters for ideas in a way that's so successful, and I was genuinely captivated, terrified. This has one of the most terrifying scenes I've ever read in a book, where Sasha gets a phone call. I won't say any more than that, but like, it's intense. And yeah, I mostly had no idea what was going on. That's the point of it. I don't normally like books like that. I would normally just be filled with rage, but yeah, this for some reason just really worked for me. I didn't understand the ending of it at all. I felt really stupid, but I loved it. And yeah, this definitely isn't going to be a book for everyone, and I think you'll know quite early on, just within a couple of pages, if this is going to be a book that you will like or not. I was captivated from the start, so if you're finding you're not enjoying it when you start it, just don't carry on with it because you won't like it. But yeah, I think this is a real masterpiece of fiction. For Belgium, we're going to move on to a novel that is completely void of hope and joy, and that is I've Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, and this is translated from the French, I think, by Schwartz. This is one that's been doing the rounds recently on BookTube and Bookstagram. It came out in the 90s and has just recently been translated, and in it we're following a young girl who is living in a cage underground with lots of other women, and they are constantly guarded by men. They have no concept now of the day, of what's going on, of where they are, no concept of like night and day, like anything like that. And we don't know how they came to be here or why. And the protagonist of the novel, who is unnamed throughout, she's the only one who is too young to remember her life before, so she has no recollection of like anything beyond this cage. And yeah, I don't think I really want to tell you anything more than that, because it's quite a slow book. I'd say there is a plot, but it's not really a storyline as such, if that makes sense, and you never get any answers or resolutions. But yeah, it's really about the journey that the protagonist goes on, and it raises a lot of really interesting discussions. I thought this was really, really good. Now for Czechia, we have the goat of absurdist fiction, our socialist king, Franz Kafka. And maybe it's a basic choice, but I'm going for the Metamorphosis. It's his most popular story for a reason. You probably don't need me to tell you what this is about. It's the story of Gregor Samsa. He's a travelling salesman who inexplicably wakes up as a giant bug one day. And I just love how chaotic this story is, because he's not really alarmed that he's woken up as a bug. He's more concerned with how he's going to get to work. And his family don't really care that he's a bug. They're just like, oh, he looks a bit gross and that's kind of disgusting, but also where are we going to get our money from now, because he's our main breadwinner. And nobody really questions why he wakes up as a bug. It just seems like it's a random event. It's not a moral judgment. There's just no rhyme or reason to it in this chaotic universe. And yeah, everybody just accepts it as their new life. And it really discusses alienation, humanity, and the self. And you could read it through so many different lenses, like whose metamorphosis is it? Is it Gregor's? Is it the family's? What does the bug symbolise? I mean, I personally view it through like a Marxist disability societal kind of lens, but yeah, you could just write essays on this. It's so interesting, and again, it's really short. There are lots of different translations of this, but I would recommend one of the newer ones if you do pick it up. For Austria, I'm cheating a little bit because I've chosen a book by Ursula Poznansky, and I haven't actually read the book that I'm recommending. I've read Seculum, which is a horror thriller about a group of teenagers who go out into the middle of nowhere to basically like LARP as if they're living in the 14th century, and then loads of creepy stuff starts happening and people start going missing. And yeah, it's really good, but it hasn't been translated into English, so I'm going to recommend Erebos, which is on my TBR, and I will just read out the blurb for that because that's the best way to do it, I think. It says, Nick is given a sinister but brilliant computer game called Erebos. The game is highly addictive but asks its players to carry out actions in the real world in order to keep playing online, actions which become more and more terrifyingly manipulative. As Nick loses friends and all sense of right and wrong in the real world, he gains power and advances further towards his online goal to become one of the inner circle of Erebos. But what is virtual and what is reality? How far will Nick go to achieve his goal? And what does Erebos really want? So I think Ursula Poznansky is really good at building a creepy atmosphere, and Seculum was genuinely a bit scary to me, even though it's YA. So I'm hoping Erebos will have the same effect. It seems kind of like Black Mirror-esque. I think it was written quite a while ago, so maybe it's a bit dated now, but I think it still sounds really interesting. And this is translated from the German by Judith Pattinson. Now we're on to the last of the countries that I've actually read from, and I'm going to recommend for France Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux, translated into English by Tanya Leslie. This book is pain and I love it. I think it's technically a non-fiction. It's one of those, in the UK it's a Fitzcarraldo with the white cover, so you're never like quite sure, but it's basically Annie Ernaux documenting what I think is her affair with a married man who lives abroad, and she only sees him when he's on business in France. She knows that it's only an affair and this man will never love her, and she still becomes completely infatuated by him and sort of measures the passing of time by when she sees him and how long passes between their meetings. She basically just ceases to live her life when she's apart from him. I think the UK blurb expresses it really well, actually. It says, Ernaux seeks the truth behind an existence lived for a time entirely for someone else. And the reason it's so painful is because she knows that love is unrequited and that eventually he's going to leave her. and she can't even enjoy the moment she has with him because she's so conscious of it ending, and she knows how painful it's going to be when it ends. And yeah, even though she's a woman who's having an affair with a married man, you feel so much like grief and sympathy for her. My favourite line from this is, "I experience pleasure like a future pain." Just, it really got me. And yeah, this is another really short one. I listened to it on audio and it was less than an hour, I think, but highly recommend. Now we're getting into the countries that I haven't yet read from, but books that are on my TBR, and we'll start with Switzerland. And I'm really surprised that I haven't read anything by a Swiss author, or at least I couldn't see that I had. I do have a book by a Swiss author on my TBR, and that is The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse, which I bought at least 15 years ago and still have not read because it scares me. I think it's a sci-fi novel of sorts, set in the 23rd century, and it's about a man who sets out to master the glass bead game. It seems very philosophical and terrifying, and there's a high chance I'll absolutely hate it, but I'm also very intrigued. Next up we have Slovakia, and when I was doing my research I found an author called Irina Brezhna, who was born in Bratislava but has spent most of her adult life in Switzerland. As far as I can tell, she writes in German, and I think only one of her books has been translated into English, and that is The Thankless Foreigner. So the blurb for that is, in 1968, in search of a better world, a young person flees her country and ends up in Switzerland, the land of hard cheese. There she's told not to talk nonsense or not to talk cheese, as they say in the local dialect. Home is where you can grumble, but here you have to be grateful. Her new environs seem unwieldy, aloof, and she rebels against this host country that insists on her following its rules, that won't let her be herself. But as an interpreter, she meets many others who have ended up here: petty criminals, depressives, hustlers, refugees, victims of exploitation, and others who have gone out of their way to assimilate, people who share a hope that they can make something new of their lives. Gradually, she learns to experience the richness of exile and foreignness, to build bridges between cultures. A brilliantly written novel about the search for identity between assimilation and resistance, Irina Brezhna's The Thankless Foreigner is a significant addition to the important literature of immigrant experience. So I think this sounds, again, like it might be a piece of autofiction, at least to an extent. And yeah, it seems like it could be in conversation with Assembly, with Not a Novel, with Free. It's just like the kind of book that I would like. I really love novels about how geographical and cultural borders shape identity, so this sounds so good to me. I'm also really interested in reading The Best of All Worlds, which focuses on a small girl growing up under Central European socialism in the 50s, and kind of the absurdity of that juxtaposed with the mundanity of her life. As far as I can tell, it hasn't been translated into English, but I was able to find an excerpt online, which I'll leave linked down below. So for Turkey, I have two books by Elif Shafak. The first is 10 minutes 38 seconds in this strange world, in which we're following a sex worker who has been murdered, but she's still recalling her life and memories for 10 minutes and 38 seconds after her death. And it sounds really sad and hard-hitting, but I've heard nothing but good reviews about that. And the other one is The 40 Rules of Love, which I've just bought on Kindle sale because it sounded really interesting to me. This one, I'll read the blurb for this one. This says, Ella Rubinstein has a husband, 3 teenage children and a pleasant home, everything that should make her confident and fulfilled. Yet there is an emptiness at the heart of Ella's life, an emptiness once filled by love. So when Hella reads a manuscript about the 13th century Sufi poet Rumi and Shams of Tabriz and his 40 Rules of Love and Life, her world is turned upside down. She embarks on a journey to meet the mysterious author of this work. It's a quest filled with Sufi mysticism and verse, taking Ella and us into an exotic world where faith and love are heartbreakingly explored. I have had my pick for Georgia, The Eighth Life by Nino Harachvili, translated by Charlotte Collins and Ruth Martin, on my TBR for a good few years, but it scares me because it's 1,000 pages plus and it's a family saga set in Russia, which is giving Anna Karenina vibes. The blurb says, at the start of the 20th century, on the edge of the Russian Empire, a family prospers. It owes its success to a delicious chocolate recipe passed down the generations with great solemnity and caution, a caution which is justified, This is a recipe for ecstasy that carries a very bitter aftertaste. Stasha learns about it from her Georgian father and takes it north, following her new husband Simon to his posting at the centre of the Russian Revolution in St. Petersburg. Stasha's is only the first in a symphony of grand but all too often doomed romances that swirl from sweet to sour in this epic tale of the Red Century. Tumbling down the years and across the vast expanses of longing and loss, generation after generation of this compelling family hears echoes and sees reflections. Great characters and greater relationships come and go and come again. The world shakes and shakes some more, and the reader rejoices to have found, at last, one of the glorious old books in which you can live and learn, be lost and found, and make indelible new friends. I do love a good family saga, and this has received so many amazing reviews. I really want to give it a try when I'm feeling brave. For Croatia, we have Baba Yaga Laid an Egg by Dubravka Urgazic, and this is translated from Croatian by Ellen Elias Burzak, Celia Hawksworth and Mark Thompson. This is part of the Canongate Myth series, and I absolutely love the tale of Baba Yaga, so I'm really excited to read this one. I think this is more of a reworking of the myth of Baba Yaga in a more contemporary setting. Again, the blurb for this one says, Baba Yaga is a witch-like character who flies around on a giant mortar, kidnapping and presumably eating small children. She lives in a house on chicken feet. She is generally a terrifying figure portrayed not only in literature but also film, animation and music throughout Russian culture. Dubravka Urgazic takes the story of Baba Yaga and weaves it into something completely fresh. The result is an extraordinary meditation on femininity, aging, identity, secrets, storytelling and love. So yeah, I think that sounds really good. Admittedly, I haven't read it, but St. Pauli, Another Football is Possible is a book that I would recommend to anybody who says that football isn't political, and this is my pick for Spain. I've heard this being used against players and fans who use football as a means of promoting activism, and I'm just like, you're following a sport with teams that are almost entirely delineated by geographical borders. Like, what about that isn't political to you? This is written by Carlos Viñas and Nacho Parra, and it's translated by Luke Stobart, and it looks at the intersection between politics and football at Hamburg St. Pauli Football Club. The blurb says, FC St. Pauli is a football club unlike any other, encompassing music, sport and politics. Its fans welcome refugees, fight fascists and take a stand against all forms of discrimination. This book goes behind the skull and crossbones emblem to the story of a football club rewriting the rulebook. Since the club's beginnings in Hamburg's red light district, the chants, banners and atmosphere of the stadium have been dictated by the politics of the streets. Promotions are celebrated and relegations commiserated, alongside social struggles, workers' protests and resistance to Nazism. In recent years, people have flocked from all over the world to join the Black Bloc in the stands of the Millerntor Stadium, and while in the 1980s the club had a small DIY punk following, now there are almost 30,000 in attendance at games with supporters across the world. In a sporting landscape governed by corrupt capitalism, driven by revenue and divorced from community, FC St. Pauli demonstrate that another football is possible. I think this one sounds really interesting, even if you're not a football fan. I had to do a little bit more research on Serbian literature, but I came across the poet Ana Ristovic on the Asymptote Literary Journal, which I highly recommend if you're interested in translated literature, as they have loads of like interviews with translators, with authors. They have extracts from novels, essays, poems, and there's just so much. It's really great because you can filter by the language as well, so it's a really good place to get a feel for what kinds of works are being translated from those languages, and gives you an idea of authors and countries that you might want to explore further. I was able to read a few of Ana Ristovic's poems on there. I'll link them below, and the translator's notes that accompany works are really, really fascinating to read on there too. I'm now really keen to read Ana Ristovic's poetry collection Directions for Use, which is described as erotic, wry, feminist poems concerning daily routines, washing laundry, doing crossword puzzles. In her writing, she explores the inner and outer worlds, sex and relationships. This bilingual selection unveils a rich embroidery of frank sexuality and lyric images. On the surface, Ristovic's poems read smoothly and almost easily as she wittingly and winkingly banters about polishing her nails or doing laundry as she opens the door to her new Belgrade world on the Danube Quay. Before one knows, one is seduced into a light-hearted conversation about daily chores and salad making, as outside the blizzard howls with ease and without a care buries our mutual threshold. I really thought I'd read something by an Italian author, but just looking through all the books I've read, I somehow don't think I have. Elena Ferrante is the obvious choice, but honestly I'm not hugely interested in any of her works. I do have Calvino as If on a Winter's Night a Traveller on my shelves, but honestly just reading the synopsis of that gives me a headache. I'm going to try it someday, but honestly I think it will fill me with rage. So yeah, I think maybe I'd like to give Natalia Ginsburg a try, but I'm not really sure where to start. Maybe her short stories, I don't know. I thought Italy would be an easy country to recommend from, but apparently I've got nothing. I think Slovenia had the slimmest pickings of all because there really just isn't a huge amount translated into English from Slovenian. Again, I used Asymptote for research, and what struck me was an image used on an extract from Katja Perat's historical novel The Masochist. I really liked this image, and so I read the extract, and that also had me intrigued. The translator, Olivia Hallowell, described the novel as on Christmas Eve 1874, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, whom history would remember as the most famous masochist, left his home in Bruck an der Mur in Austria and disappeared into the unknown. Katja Perat's historical debut suggests that he didn't return alone, but with a new family member, a tiny red-haired girl he found in the forest around Lemberg, today's Lviv, Ukraine. The Masochist is a memoir of Nadezhda Moser, the woman who this little girl grew up to be, an invented historical figure who inhabits a very real historical place and meets very real people of her time. The Masochist is a story that contemplates the limits of female desire and freedom against the backdrop of ethnic, class and gender tensions of an empire yet unaware of its decline. That sounds really, really good actually. The last country, Portugal, is causing me no ends of bother because there must be a Portuguese book out there that I will love, but honestly I'm struggling to find one that I'm genuinely interested in. I think it's because my arch nemesis Bruno Fernandes plays for Portugal, and if Bruno Fernandes has no haters, I am dead. Also because at this point in my research I was incredibly burned out and overwhelmed by book synopses, so I leave Portugal to you. If you know of any Portuguese literature that you think I would like based on all the other books I've recommended, please let me know, because there must be something. There must be a book that I would want to read from Portugal. So yeah, I look forward to hearing your suggestions. So that is all the books that I have to recommend to you in this video. Please let me know if you have read any of them, which ones are on your TBR, any that you would recommend to me. I would love to hear it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye.